The phone fell from my hand somewhere between the bedroom door and the window. I remember the screen cracking against the hardwood floor because sound travels differently when you're in shock. It echoes in ways that feel significant, like your brain is grasping for any detail that makes sense. 3 months of unemployment. 3 months of networking calls and portfolio reviews and interviews that ended with polite rejections. I'd finally scheduled a meeting with a firm for the following Monday. New opportunity. Fresh start. That was supposed to matter. That was supposed to change things. Instead, I was learning that the world could change in ways that had nothing to do with my carefully constructed plans. The hands came through the window, reaching across the sill with startling precision. I'd been asleep maybe 3 minutes when the glass broke. Not a smash, something calculated. A circle cut cleanly from the lower pane with tools I didn't recognize and wouldn't understand until much later. 1 hand, then 2. Then suddenly there were bodies moving through my apartment with the efficiency of people who had done this before. They moved like water finding cracks. Something that could be transported. The vehicle was industrial. I caught that much before consciousness started fragmenting. Metal walls. The smell of diesel and salt. Something about the temperature suggested we were near water. My mind, still partly aware despite the chemicals, tried to construct meaning from sensory data. Harbor? Port? The thought that should have comforted me, that being near a populated area meant rescue, safety, instead crystallized into something closer to terror. If we were at a port, we were near transportation. We were being moved. The container door, because that's what it was, I understood this immediately, closed with a sound like finality given physical form. A bolt slid into place. The darkness that followed wasn't the darkness of night. It was absolute, total, the kind of darkness that existed before light was invented. I wasn't alone. I could hear them almost immediately. Small sounds, breathing, a muffled sob, the scrape of fingernails against metal. How many? I couldn't tell. The darkness had weight, and it compressed distance, made individual sounds seem to come from everywhere simultaneously. Hello? My voice came out strange, fractured, as if someone else was speaking through my throat. Is anyone? Don't. A woman's voice interrupted. Asian accent. Calm in a way that suggested she'd been in this darkness before and had accepted certain things about it. Just don't. Talking uses energy. You'll need the air. The engine started. A deep vibration that traveled up through the container floor and into my bones. My stomach registered the motion before my brain caught up. We were moving, being transported somewhere. Every rational thought I possessed wanted to construct escape scenarios, to imagine how this might be resolved, to believe that my architecture degree and my family and the person I'd been 7 hours ago mattered enough that someone would come looking. I didn't believe any of it. The other woman who'd spoken, she said her name was Camilla, though I wondered if it was true or a protective fiction, told me we were being trafficked. The word hung in the darkness between us like something toxic that shouldn't be named but had to be. Trafficked. The kind of thing you read about in news articles, in reports about organizations that seem to operate in other countries, other worlds. Not Boston. Not your apartment with the view of the common and the small kitchen you'd decorated carefully during a moment when you still believed the future would look a certain way. How long have you been? I started. 6 months, Camilla interrupted. Maybe longer. Time works differently here. You stop counting days. You stop believing that the counting matters. There were 4 others. I couldn't see them, but I counted the breathing patterns. One of them wasn't breathing normally. Shallow. Rapid. The sound of someone in panic that had crystallized into a permanent state. Another was completely silent, which somehow felt more disturbing than the crying. The cold came gradually, or maybe I just became aware of it slowly. My dress, that gray dress that had made me feel professional, capable, interview-ready, was thin, insufficient. My shoes had been taken. I tried to catalog what had happened in what order, but the timeline kept fragmenting. How long had we been here? Hours? The engine noise suggested significant travel. The salt smell intensified. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, like we were collectively exhaling our futures into an increasingly limited space. One of the silent women started moving. not escaping, just shifting, pressing against the container walls as if she might find a give, some weakness in the construction. There wasn't any. This container had been built to hold cargo. We were cargo now. "They're taking us to the docks," Camilla said. She was sitting near me, close enough that I could smell her. Fear, yes, but also resignation. At least that's what happened to me. They collect us, transport us by ship, then transfer to distribution. Distribution to where? Anywhere that pays. The words didn't fully process. Or they processed, but my mind refused the full implications. I'd read about trafficking. I'd seen documentaries. I'd felt the appropriate emotional response to other people's tragedies, but I hadn't believed, in any fundamental way, that it could happen to me. That the thing your parents warn you about, that feels abstract and distant when you're an employed 26-year-old professional, could become your actual reality in the span of minutes. I was learning otherwise. Hours accumulated, or what felt like hours. The container shifted occasionally. Loading operations, Camilla explained in her flat voice. More people were added. We made room for them because we had no choice. The air became increasingly difficult. Someone was crying constantly now, not just tears. Full-body sobs that shook the entire container because sound amplifies in confined spaces. I wanted to comfort her. I tried to reach toward the sound. But what comfort could I offer? We were trapped in metal darkness waiting for a future we didn't want to imagine. The motion changed. The rumble deepened. We weren't just moving now. We were floating. The container swayed slightly, a motion that was incredibly disorienting in absolute darkness. The ship was moving. We were at sea now, heading toward a destination that nobody in this container would have chosen. And then, without warning, everything changed. The sound came first. Gunshots. Rapid fire. Loud enough to cause actual pain in my ears. The other women screamed. I was screaming too, but the scream came out as something primal and instinctive, divorced from rational thought. The container lurched. Someone fell hard against metal. The violence outside continued. More gunshots, shouting, the sound of what might have been sirens. I thought we were dying. That seemed like the most rational conclusion given the available information. We were trapped. Something violent was happening beyond the container walls. Logic suggested we were casualties of whatever conflict was occurring. Trapped casualties who wouldn't survive to become victims of whatever fate awaited us. But then, silence. The kind of silence that follows violence and carries its own weight. And then the bolt sliding back. Light. The concept of light seemed almost fictional after hours of absolute darkness. It came through the opening container door in a way that made my eyes water. Made me cover my face with hands that didn't feel entirely like mine anymore. Behind the light, movement. A silhouette. A man. Tall. The kind of physical presence that seemed to take up the space even before he spoke. "Come out," he said. English, with an accent I couldn't identify. Slowly. One at a time. "You're safe now." I asked about the other women. The one who sobbed until the container seemed to vibrate with it. The one who never made a sound. And Camilla, who had taught me how to breathe in the dark. Alessandro said names were being matched, that hospitals and shelters were a better kind of triage than bravado. 2 days later, a victim advocate called. Camilla had a bed, a doctor, and paperwork with her real name on it. The advocate gave me a card for a counselor who specialized in people who spoke in floor plans and alarms. I went because there are rooms you can only enter if someone else holds the door. She didn't ask me to retell the worst night. She asked me to list the decisions I had made that were mine. We filled a page. I left with homework that sounded like logistics. Eat with both feet on the floor, lock the phone in a drawer after midnight, name one thing I would not negotiate. The list made the day feel measurable. I didn't know her last name, but I knew the relief that came with the word stabilized. Weeks later, the advocate left a voicemail I played 3 times. Camilla had asked to be transferred to a different city, somewhere she could walk without translating every doorway. I didn't keep the message, but I kept the timestamp. Small facts you can carry without cutting yourself. And it was the first proof that the darkness we'd shared could end in different rooms, with different lights. The irony of those words, "You're safe," would take weeks to fully process. But in that moment, standing on solid ground for the first time since the chemical-soaked cloth had come down across my face, I held on to those words like they were the only true thing left in a world that had revealed itself to be fundamentally different from what I'd believed. The man reached down to help me to my feet. His hand was warm. His eyes were dark brown, impossible to read. Behind him, federal agents were securing the dock, covering bodies with tarps, securing the scene of violence that had apparently been my salvation. "What's your name?" he asked. "Olivia," I said. The word felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. Someone who'd had a future planned out, an apartment, an interview scheduled for Monday. "I'm Alessandro," he said. Alessandro came by in a jacket that made him look like a decision someone else had already made. He stayed at the threshold the way people do when they know they've taken too much space before. I told him my rules. No surprises, no midnight plans announced at 11:59. And if he needed to choose between Empire and Oxygen, he'd choose Oxygen. He said that wasn't how empires worked. I said then it wasn't my problem to fix. He laughed once, the good kind, the kind that admits the room just changed, and nodded. We shook on it like it was business, because it was. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question. But then again, I wasn't really in a position to ask questions anymore. I followed him toward whatever came next, understanding only that everything I'd been was now behind me, sealed away in that metal container like a past that could never be fully recovered. The car ride took approximately 40 minutes. I know this because the part of my mind that wasn't in complete dissociation kept counting. 40 minutes meant distance. Distance meant they couldn't bring me back immediately. Distance meant something, or nothing. My brain kept grasping for logic in a situation that had revealed itself to be fundamentally illogical. Alessandro sat across from me in the backseat of a black SUV. He didn't speak during the drive. Neither did the two men who flanked him. I watched the city of Boston blur past the tinted windows, trying to construct meaning from what I was seeing. We were heading west, away from the water. "The penthouse," he'd said. His penthouse. "Why did you stop them?" I asked at some point during that 40-minute drive. My voice sounded strange, hollowed out. "Because they were operating in my territory," Alessandro said simply. "Russian cartel. They didn't have permission." Permission. As if this was a matter of bureaucratic oversight, rather than human beings being transported like cargo. I wanted to feel anger at that response. Instead, I felt something closer to numbness. The numbness was better. The numbness meant I didn't have to process the full implications of being saved by someone whose primary concern was territorial violation rather than human trafficking. "What happens now?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried that same calm that I'd heard at the docks. "Now you rest. Now you recover. Now you understand that you're safe." The penthouse occupied the top floor of a building in Back Bay. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Modern furniture arranged with geometric precision. Art on the walls that probably had artist names and exhibition histories attached to it. It was beautiful in the way expensive spaces are beautiful. Carefully curated, void of genuine comfort, designed to communicate wealth rather than provide sanctuary. "You'll need medical attention," Alessandro said as soon as we arrived. It wasn't a question. He was already on his phone, already arranging things. A doctor arrived within the hour. I texted my mother a photo of the skyline because words felt like a courtroom I wasn't ready to enter. She called in seconds. I didn't tell her about the container. I told her I was safe, that I'd explain the rest when I had language that didn't taste like metal. She believed me the way only mothers do. On credit, with interest. A woman in her 60s who didn't ask questions, just examined me with professional efficiency. Checked for signs of injury, drew blood, asked me to follow her finger with my eyes, listened to my heart. The chemical I'd been exposed to had metabolized already. No permanent damage. Lucky. Lucky. That word seemed obscene in context. The doctor left medications and instructions. Hydration. Rest. Trauma responses were normal. The medications would help with sleep if I found myself unable to achieve it naturally. I didn't tell her that sleep seemed impossible. That closing my eyes meant returning to the container, meant experiencing the darkness over and over. Alessandro showed me to a bedroom. Guest room, he called it, though the size of it suggested it could accommodate an entire apartment. Fresh clothes were already laid out on the bed. Not my clothes. Clothes that fit me perfectly despite the fact that no one had taken my measurements. Soft fabrics, earth tones, a cream-colored sweater, warm brown pants. The kind of clothes meant to soothe, meant to communicate that I was in a space where comfort mattered. "There's a bathroom through there," Alessandro pointed. "Shower if you want. Everything you need has been provided." I showered for 45 minutes. The water pressure was incredible. The hot water endless. I stood under the spray and tried to wash away the smell of the container, the residue of chemical exposure, the feeling that something fundamental in me had been damaged irreparably. The water ran clear. My skin emerged clean, but the feeling persisted. The penthouse had guards. I understood this gradually over the first few hours. Men positioned at the entrance. Men in the hallway outside my bedroom. Men visible through the windows standing on the building's perimeter. They weren't treating me as a guest. They were treating me as something that required security, something precious, or something dangerous. I couldn't decide which. Alessandro visited me that evening. He brought food, soup, bread, simple things. He set the tray on the desk and observed me with those dark brown eyes that were impossible to read. "Eat," he said. "Your body needs fuel." "Why am I here?" I asked. The question I'd been avoiding since we left the docks. "Because you need protection," he said. "From what? From who?" "From the people who put you in that container. From people who might try to do it again. From the uncertainty of your position." He paused. "From yourself, perhaps. The impulse to make decisions from a place of trauma rather than clarity." "I don't know you," I said. It seemed important to state this fact. Important to establish that the gratitude I felt for not being trapped in darkness anymore didn't erase the fundamental reality of our relationship. He was a stranger who happened to have been at a dock at a specific moment. "No," Alessandro agreed. "You don't. But I knew that you needed immediate protection, and that the systems designed to provide that protection would move slowly and create paperwork trails that other people could follow. So instead, you're here. You're safe. You're secure. You have time to recover before you decide what comes next." "Am I your prisoner?" I asked directly. The question seemed to amuse him slightly. "Do you feel like a prisoner?" "I don't know what I feel like." "Then let's establish this. You are not a prisoner. You're free to leave whenever you choose. The guards you've noticed are to prevent people from coming in, not to prevent you from going out. The medications the doctor left are optional. The food is optional. Everything is optional except one thing." "What's that?" "The understanding that leaving would be dangerous. That remaining under my protection, despite its complications, is safer than attempting to navigate the outside world at this particular moment." He left after that. The door to my room closed with a soft click. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to decide if what he'd said constituted a threat or a statement of fact. The distinction seemed important and increasingly impossible to determine. That first night, I didn't sleep. I mapped exits in the ceiling's shadows the way I used to map galleries, egress, sightlines, choke points, because the body remembers what safety costs. I tried. The medications the doctor had left made sleep possible in theory, but my brain kept cycling through scenarios. The container, the darkness, the gunshots, Alessandro's face when he'd opened the container door, the expression in his eyes that contained something I couldn't quite name, protection and possession existing in the same moment, salvation that came with obligations I didn't fully understand. By morning, exhaustion had created a strange clarity. I understood that I was trapped, but not in the way I'd been trapped in the container. This trap was more sophisticated, softer, easier to convince myself might not be a trap at all. The penthouse was comfortable. The food was good. The guards were polite. The showers had excellent water pressure. But I was still trapped. And the man who'd constructed this particular trap was still a stranger. A stranger who'd apparently decided I was worth saving, or worth possessing. or worth something that I didn't yet have the language to describe. The federal agents arrived on the third day. 2 of them. A woman in her 40s with a sharp expression, and a younger man with a notebook. They sat in Alessandro's living room, not my bedroom, which suggested this was official in some way, and asked me to recount everything. I told them about the men coming through my window, about the chemical, about the container and the darkness, and Camilla and the other women, about the gunshots that had fractured the night and the moment the door opened to reveal Alessandro, standing silhouetted against dock lighting. What I didn't tell them was that I was beginning to understand the architecture of what had happened. The way Alessandro kept inserting himself into the conversation, not threatening, just present, just making clear through his proximity that whatever protection the federal system could offer, he could offer more, different, faster. "We're going to need you to testify," the female agent said. Her name was Morrison. She had kind eyes that didn't match the sharpness of her mouth. "We're building a case against the Russian operation, the trafficking network. Your testimony would be valuable." "Of course," I said. "There's protective custody available," Morrison continued. "Safe houses. The system can ensure your security while we move forward with prosecution." Alessandro shifted slightly. Just a movement. Just enough that I noticed and, more importantly, Morrison noticed that I noticed. "She'll remain here," Alessandro said quietly, "under my protection." "That's not standard procedure," Morrison replied. She wasn't looking at him. She was still looking at me, trying to communicate something through eye contact, trying to tell me that I had a choice. "I'm aware," Alessandro said. "But this is what's happening." I should have objected. Some part of me understood that objecting was the rational choice, that accepting federal protection meant stepping outside Alessandro's orbit, meant reclaiming some version of agency and independence. But that part was quieter now, worn down by days of realizing that the system Morrison represented had failed to protect me when I was taken from my apartment, that the same system had failed to notice I was missing until I could no longer be ignored. "Olivia," Morrison said directly, "do you want to be transferred to a federal safe house?" I looked at Alessandro, not for permission, for clarity, for understanding of what refusing would mean. "I'll stay," I said. Morrison's expression shifted. Disappointment, understanding, recognition of a choice being made that she couldn't prevent. She set a business card on the table. "If you change your mind." She didn't push. She scheduled weekly check-ins, handed me a list of victim advocacy contacts, and made me promise, twice, that I'd call if the number ever felt like a lifeline instead of a formality. "If you ever feel unsafe, you call this number immediately." After they left, Alessandro didn't speak. He simply walked to the window and looked out at Boston stretching below us. His silence was worse than words would have been. It communicated that he'd expected this outcome, that my choice had been inevitable from the moment he'd opened that container door. "You know that testifying while under my protection complicates things," he said eventually. "That prosecutors will question your credibility. They'll suggest you're being influenced. Are you influencing me?" "Of course," he said simply. "Through shelter, through security, through the understanding that the system that failed you once has structural problems that won't be solved by the time your case reaches trial. Yes, I'm influencing you, but not in the way they mean." The first probes landed on day 5. Nothing cinematic, just pressure where logistics are soft. Alerts, not alarms. We throttled it back with procedures and quiet calls. By evening, the point had been made on both sides, and the ledger was balanced. Not because law enforcement responded, because Alessandro's organization responded first. Property was secured, equipment was salvaged. The message was sent back through channels I didn't fully understand, but could recognize through context. This territory is not open for negotiation. 2 days later, I learned that Victor had been transferred to federal custody. Multiple charges: trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering. The Russian cartel's operation in Boston was effectively dismantled, not because of federal work alone, because Alessandro had decided it represented too much of an incursion into his territory. and had responded with organized force that left no ambiguity about who controlled what. I sat in the penthouse studying his face while he reviewed reports on a tablet. This was the man who'd saved me. This was also the man who'd systematically destroyed an entire organization. These two facts existed simultaneously and didn't cancel each other out. "I need to understand something," I said. "Why did you actually save me?" "Because the Russian cartel was in your territory, yes, but you could have addressed that without bringing me here, without protecting me. Why did you choose that?" Alessandro set down the tablet. "Because in that moment, when I opened the container, I saw someone who should not have been trapped, and I had the power to prevent that, the power to offer something the system couldn't. So I did." He paused. "The territory issue is secondary. The protection you need is real. Both things can be true." "I don't know if I believe that," I said. "Believe what you need to believe," Alessandro replied. "But stay, at least until the testimony is complete. At least until you've processed enough of what happened that you can make decisions from clarity rather than trauma." I agreed, because the alternative was stepping back into a world that had proven itself fundamentally hostile. I agreed, because safety, even safety constructed from complicated motivations, seemed better than the uncertainty outside these walls. I agreed because I was beginning to understand that Alessandro Ricci existed in moral spaces I'd never had to navigate before. Spaces where protection and possession weren't contradictory, where salvation came with obligations that weren't entirely clear. The penthouse felt different after that. Less like a prison. More like a strategic position. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to exist in the complications of Alessandro's world. And I was beginning to understand that stepping back into my previous life, if that were even possible, might require leaving behind the only person who demonstrated the power to keep me safe. The grand jury testimony took place on day 7. Federal prosecutors had been coordinating with Alessandro's lawyers for days, which seemed like an odd alliance, but made sense when you understood the mechanics of what was happening. The prosecution wanted convictions. Alessandro wanted the narrative controlled. Both objectives could be served by presenting documentation in a specific order, by curating what evidence was most visible, by allowing certain details to emerge while others remained strategically obscured. I sat in a conference room with Morrison and 2 assistant prosecutors while they prepared me. They were thorough, professional. They asked me to recall details from the container, details from the interrogations at the dock, details about the other women. They recorded my testimony. They reviewed it. They made suggestions about how to present information with maximum clarity and minimum ambiguity. What they didn't ask about was Alessandro. What he'd done. How he'd known to intervene at the precise moment. How an operation that the federal government apparently wasn't conducting had somehow resulted in the Russian cartel's primary asset being secured. The grand jury itself was anticlimactic. 12 citizens listening to my recounting of trauma. Listening to prosecutors present documentation that Viktor Sokolov had orchestrated a human trafficking operation spanning 3 continents. Listening to evidence of money laundering. Evidence of conspiracy. Evidence of coordination with other criminal organizations. By the end of the day, an indictment had been issued. Viktor Sokolov was in federal custody, facing charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. The Russian cartel's operation in Boston was being dismantled in public filings, while the streets adjusted in private. The documentation was made public. The prosecution held a press conference, and I became visible. Not by choice, by design. Alessandro had made strategic decisions about where I should appear, what events I should attend. He'd arranged for me to be photographed at a charity function 3 days after my testimony. Me in a burgundy dress, not navy, not the color I'd expected to become defined by, standing beside him at a function benefiting trafficking survivors. The photograph made the evening news. The caption described me as a survivor, as someone who'd escaped the Russian trafficking network, as someone now under the protection of prominent Boston businessman Alessandro Ricci. "Why am I being used?" I asked him directly after seeing the photograph on the news. We were in the penthouse. He was reviewing documents at the dining table. He set them aside with the precision that characterized all his movements. "You're not being used," he said. "You're being protected. There's a difference. That photograph is being used. I'm in it." "Yes," he agreed. "That's intentional. The more visible you are, the less viable you are as a target. Harming you now would create a public incident, would draw attention that no remaining Russian assets want. Visibility is protection, or visibility is branding," I said. "You're positioning yourself as someone who rescues victims, someone who protects. It builds a particular kind of reputation." He didn't deny it. He simply looked at me with that expression I was learning to read. Not quite satisfaction, more like recognition that I was beginning to understand the architecture of his world. "Both things are true," he said finally. "You are genuinely protected by your visibility. And yes, my reputation benefits from being associated with that protection. The world doesn't operate on pure motivations, Olivia. It operates on intersecting incentives. Understanding that is the beginning of wisdom." Over the next several days, information emerged about Victor. He was in federal custody at a detention facility in Massachusetts. He was facing trial on 7 counts related to human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. His bail had been set impossibly high. He wouldn't be making it. The Russian cartel's network in Boston collapsed almost immediately after his arrest. Lower-level operatives were arrested. Assets were seized. The operation that had taken me from my apartment was officially over. Federal authorities declared a victory. The news reported it as such, but something about it felt incomplete. I couldn't articulate exactly what at first. The logic was clear. Victor was captured. The cartel was dismantled. I was safe. But over the following weeks, I began to notice things. Calls Alessandro received from people I never saw. Meetings conducted in hushed voices in rooms I wasn't invited into. Men arriving and departing with urgent precision. The sense that while the Russian cartel's operation was indeed over, other operations were accelerating. "Are you consolidating power?" I asked him one evening. He was working late, reviewing financial documents. He looked up from his laptop. "The vacuum left by their collapse needed to be filled," he said. "Better by me than by someone else. Better organized. Better contained. You're expanding because they're gone." "Yes, that's not really about protecting me," I said. "That's about opportunity." "No," Alessandro corrected. "Protecting you is one thing. Expanding my organization is another. They're not contradictory. They're simultaneous. I can do both. I am doing both." I realized around day 18 that I'd moved into a different kind of cage. Not the container. Not even the penthouse with its locked doors and stationed guards. This cage was constructed from visibility and complexity, and the understanding that leaving would be far more complicated than remaining. The charity photographs continued. Events at which I was positioned next to Alessandro. Careful compositions that suggested rescue narrative. Suggested that this was a man who saved people. A man with power who used it benevolently. A man who was owed loyalty and gratitude and silence. I was becoming his proof of character, his investment in the narrative of being more than what he actually was. And the worst part was that the narrative wasn't entirely false. He had saved me. He had protected me. He had used intelligence and force to dismantle an organization that was destroying lives. He'd also used me to build his reputation. Used my trauma to create public positioning. Used my visibility to communicate messages about his power and his protection to everyone operating within his sphere of influence. When I tried to articulate this to him, he didn't defend himself. He simply looked at me with that expression of recognition. "You're beginning to understand how the world actually functions," he said. "Most people never do. Most people prefer their stories simple. Good and bad. Rescue and victimhood. Black and white. You're learning that everything is gray. That survival requires accepting complexity. That protection costs something. Usually agency. Usually the right to be entirely certain about your own positioning." Victor appeared in court 2 weeks after my grand jury testimony. I was required to be there, to provide in-person testimony, to look at the man who'd orchestrated my trafficking and communicate through that look the impact of his choices. It was devastating in a way I hadn't anticipated, not because I felt vindicated, because I understood that destroying him didn't undo what had happened to me. Didn't return the version of Olivia who'd existed before the container. Didn't make the penthouse less of a cage, even though it was infinitely more comfortable than the container had been. After the testimony, Alessandro met me in the courthouse hallway. He took my hand. It was the first public display of physical affection between us. The photographers captured it immediately. "You did well," he said. "I testified about being trafficked," I replied. "That's not performance. That's just survival. It's both," he said. "Always both. That's what you have to accept if you're going to stay." I understood what he was asking. Not for love. Not even for genuine partnership. For acceptance of the architecture. For understanding that I existed now in spaces that couldn't be neatly categorized. Protected and imprisoned. Rescued and possessed. Visible and invisible. I was learning to live in those spaces. Learning to breathe in ambiguity. Learning that the alternative to Alessandro's complicated protection was returning to a world that had proven itself far more hostile than any penthouse could ever be. The phone calls started around 3 a.m. I wasn't sleeping. I'd stopped sleeping predictably somewhere around day 9 of being in the penthouse. My body had developed an internal rhythm that bore no relationship to clock time. I'd wake at odd hours, sit at the window, watch Boston sleep below, try to convince myself that the life I'd lived before the container still existed somewhere in the city's geography. The calls were different. Urgent. Alessandro took them in sequence in his office. I stood in the kitchen drinking water that tasted like nothing, trying not to listen but unable to avoid hearing fragments through the open doorway. 3 locations. Simultaneous. Economic pressure. Property damage. The Russian cartel wasn't finished. They were pressing back. "They're going after the warehouses," Alessandro said when he emerged from his office. He was already dressed. Already moving with that particular kind of precision that meant decisions had already been made, and the restaurant in Seaport, and the construction management company in Cambridge. "Why?" I asked, though I understood. Retaliation. Response to Victor's capture. Demonstration that his imprisonment didn't mean his network had ceased to function. "Because they can," Alessandro said simply. "Because they need to communicate that Victor's capture didn't eliminate them entirely. Because I eliminated their primary operation. And they need to reclaim some version of dignity through economic disruption." He made phone calls. Not many. Just enough. Within 30 minutes, men began arriving at the penthouse. Not in dramatic waves. In small groups through different entrances. They came with the efficiency of people who'd been trained for emergencies. They received briefings from Alessandro, maps on screens, addresses, estimated damage parameters. Then they deployed. I watched from the living room as the penthouse transformed into a war room. Not literally. There were no weapons visible. Just men with phones and tablets coordinating with other men at identified locations. The precision was almost beautiful, almost clinical. Alessandro sat at the dining table with coffee that grew cold while he orchestrated. "Warehouse 1 is secure," someone reported through Alessandro's earpiece. "Construction site fortified," another voice confirmed. "Restaurant staff evacuated." A third communication relayed. Within 2 hours, property damage had been contained. Equipment had been salvaged or relocated. The economic impact the Russian cartel had attempted to inflict was significantly reduced. The message was clear. This territory belonged to Alessandro. His operations were protected. His security protocols were sophisticated enough to prevent the kind of harm that required advance notice and coordinated strikes. By dawn, the response was already being organized. Not through police. Through channels I didn't fully understand but could recognize. Information was being sent back through intermediaries. Money was being moved. Pressure was being applied in directions that would make continued retaliation prohibitively expensive for whoever remained in the Russian hierarchy. "They'll try again," I said. It wasn't really a question. "Probably," Alessandro agreed. "But they'll do it knowing the cost. They'll calculate whether maintaining face is worth the economic disruption. Usually it isn't." 2 days later, Morrison called. Viktor Sokolov had been transferred to federal custody. Multiple charges: trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering. The documents were being filed. The prosecution was accelerating. He would be held without bail. His assets were being frozen. His network was being systematically dismantled through legal channels. The news coverage was extensive. Photographs of Victor being transported. Commentary about the effectiveness of federal coordination with local law enforcement. No mention of Alessandro. No acknowledgement of how the specific timing of Victor's capture had coincided with the dock operation. No indication that systematic intelligence gathering had preceded the physical intervention. But everyone operating within Boston's criminal infrastructure would know, would understand the message, would recognize that someone with Alessandro's resources and sophistication had moved against the Russian cartel and won. Completely. Definitively. I noticed the changes gradually over the following days. Different people visiting the penthouse. Different conversations conducted in different rooms. Different energy moving through the organization. The immediate crisis had passed. Now came consolidation. Now came the work of filling the vacuum left by the Russian cartel's collapse. "You're expanding," I said to Alessandro 3 days after Victor's transfer to federal custody. He was reviewing documents, financial statements, acquisition proposals, things that suggested legitimate business expansion, but also suggested something else entirely. Territory being reorganized, influence being repositioned, power being redistributed across a landscape that had just been significantly altered. "The vacuum needed to be filled," he said. "Better by me than by someone else. Better organized, better contained." "By us," I said. "You keep saying you're protecting me, but I'm here. I'm watching. I'm beginning to understand how this actually works." He set down his pen, looked at me directly. "Yes, by us. You're right. That's what you need to accept if you're going to remain here. You're not a prisoner. You're not a guest. You're becoming something else. Something more complicated." I understood what he was offering. Not love, not romance, not the kind of simple emotional transaction that existed in the life I'd lived before the container. He was offering integration, visibility, the understanding that I was becoming part of his infrastructure, his organization, his world. And the worst part was that the alternative seemed infinitely more dangerous. The system that was supposed to protect me had proven itself sluggish and complicated. Alessandro had proven himself efficient and responsive. He'd saved me because I was valuable. He was keeping me because I continued to be valuable. And now I was becoming something that served his interests while also being protected by them. Over the next week, Sophia appeared, Alessandro's sister. She was elegant, professional, an executive at a legitimate company that definitely had non-legitimate connections. She visited the penthouse and sat across from me with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what my position entailed. "He's not evil," she said without preamble. "That's the first thing you need to understand. He's practical. He's intelligent. He operates within a system that requires certain moral compromises. But he doesn't prey on innocent people. That distinction matters." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're staying," Sophia said simply. "Because my brother has decided that you're worth protecting, which means you're worth integrating, and because I recognize that expression on your face. It's the same expression I had when I first understood what my family actually does, and the same expression I had when I realized that leaving was more dangerous than staying." She left the penthouse after less than an hour, but her words remained. Her recognition of my trajectory remained. The understanding that I was being offered a choice that looked like freedom, but was fundamentally a different kind of commitment. I stood at the window watching Boston's evening lights multiply across the darkness, and tried to decide if what was happening was rescue or capture or something else entirely that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. The container had represented one kind of imprisonment. The penthouse represented another. But somewhere between those two extremes lay a version of life that included agency. That included choice. That included remaining, because staying served my interests as much as it served his. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was survival translated into something that could resemble a life. The news came through formal channels. Viktor Sokolov's trial date had been set. 7 months away. Enough time for discovery. Enough time for the federal system to build its case. Enough time for me to understand what my role would be. Enough time to decide if testifying in open court was something I could survive. Morrison visited 2 days after the trial date announcement. She brought documents, protective measures available to witnesses, options for testimony via closed-circuit television, options for anonymity in certain circumstances, options that suggested the federal government recognized that my visibility had become a liability rather than an asset. "You've done significant damage to the trafficking network," Morrison said, settling into one of Alessandro's designer chairs with the ease of someone accustomed to being in expensive spaces. "Your testimony at the grand jury was instrumental in securing the indictment. Your continued cooperation will be valuable during trial." "I understand," I said. "What you need to understand," Morrison continued, "is that your proximity to Alessandro Ricci has created complications. Defense counsel will argue that you're biased, that his organization has incentive to ensure your testimony aligns with his interests, that your presence in his home suggests improper influence. I'm here because I need protection," I said. The statement was true enough. Partially true. Some fraction of the truth. "I know," Morrison replied. "But perception matters in court. What I'm offering is an alternative. Federal protection, a safe house, testimony given from neutral ground." After she left, I understood what was actually being offered. Not alternative protection. A decision point. A moment where I had to choose between the system that had failed me and the man who had saved me. The penthouse felt different after that conversation. Less like sanctuary. More like a choice I was actively making, rather than a circumstance I was simply enduring. 3 days later, federal agents arrived at one of Alessandro's legitimate businesses, a restaurant in Seaport. They presented a warrant, requested documentation, conducted interviews. The investigation was ongoing. The prosecution was thorough. They were examining every connection between Alessandro and the port operations, every transaction that might suggest coordination, every communication that might indicate prior knowledge. They found nothing that implicated him directly, because there was nothing. Because Alessandro had been careful enough to ensure that his organization's response to the Russian cartel operated through channels that didn't touch his legitimate businesses. Because he understood that proximity to criminal activity required structural separation. But they were looking. They were asking questions. They were trying to construct a narrative that positioned him as something other than what he appeared to be in the media coverage. A businessman who'd saved trafficking victims. "They won't find anything," Alessandro said to me that evening. We were standing at the window watching Boston's skyline transition from day to evening, because I've spent decades understanding how investigations work, how evidence gets preserved, how testimony connects to documentation. I know the architecture better than they do. "Until they do find something," I said, "then we'll address it," he replied simply. The following week brought unexpected news. Victor had attempted suicide in his federal detention cell. Unsuccessful. He was now in medical observation. The news coverage was dramatic. Coverage of a man facing decades of incarceration choosing to end his situation rather than face trial. Coverage that suggested desperation. Suggested that the case was overwhelming. Suggested that conviction was inevitable. But it also meant my testimony would matter less. A jury seeing a suicidal defendant might assume guilt without needing extensive testimony. The case could resolve through plea negotiation. Victor might accept a deal rather than face trial. My visibility as a witness might become unnecessary. I realized around day 7 that I'd stopped counting the days since my rescue, that the timeline of my life had reorganized itself around Alessandro's operations, rather than around my own recovery. That my understanding of safety had fundamentally shifted from being about absence of danger to being about presence of power. "You need to decide," Alessandro said to me late one evening. He was reviewing financial documents. I was reading something that didn't require my full attention. "Are you staying because you feel you have no alternative? Or are you staying because you've decided this is where you want to be?" "I don't know the difference," I admitted. "One is imprisonment," he said. "The other is choice, even if the choice is complicated." Federal investigators returned to the penthouse 3 times over the following days. Morrison came with them once. They wanted to interview me about Alessandro, about our relationship, about whether I'd observed any criminal activity, about whether I'd been coerced into remaining. No, I answered to all of it. I haven't been coerced. I've been protected. From what? One of the investigators asked. From a world that's already proven itself hostile to me, I said. From people who are still in the Russian organization. From the uncertainty of whether the federal system can actually keep me safe. From the question of what comes next when the official protection ends and I'm returned to ordinary life. They didn't like that answer, but they couldn't refute it. By day 8, the federal investigation into Alessandro's operations had concluded without findings that would support criminal charges. The investigation into the Russian cartel would continue. Documentation would be assembled. Victor's trial would proceed. But Alessandro would remain untouched, legally separate from the operations that had dismantled his rival. Morrison called me personally to discuss my trial testimony options. You don't have to testify, she said. Victor will likely accept a plea deal. Multiple counts. Minimum sentencing guidelines will be high enough that he won't walk away from any deal. Your testimony might be unnecessary. What happens to me if I'm not needed? I asked. Then the federal protection concludes. You're released from protective custody. You're free to resume your life. Free. The word seemed almost fictional at that point. I told Morrison I would testify regardless, that I didn't need the federal system's permission to provide testimony, that my role wasn't dependent on whether it was strategically necessary, that I had something to say about what happened to me, and I would say it. After disconnecting the call, I found Alessandro in his office. He was reviewing architectural drawings of properties being acquired, portfolio expansion, evidence of ongoing consolidation. I'm staying, I told him simply. He set down the drawings. Because the alternative is returning to a life that doesn't exist anymore. Because the version of Olivia Grant who existed before the container is gone, and I have no idea how to reconstruct her. Because you're offering something that resembles safety even if it's complicated. I paused. Because I'm beginning to understand that complicated safety is better than the illusion of simple safety. That's not love, he said. No, I agreed. It's not. But it's something. It's a foundation for something that might eventually become more complex than either of us understands right now. He nodded slowly. Then you're not a guest anymore. You're not under protection. You're part of the infrastructure. I understand, I said. And I did. I understood that I'd crossed a threshold. That I'd moved from being a victim who'd been rescued to being someone who was choosing to remain within Alessandro's world. That my testimony would be given from a position of integration, rather than neutrality. That the defense would argue bias and they would be correct, even if their definition of bias didn't capture what was actually happening between us. I was choosing this. However complicated, however dangerous, however uncertain the future remained. The negotiations took place over 3 days. Not in any formal sense. No lawyers. No contracts signed in front of witnesses. Just conversations between Alessandro and me that gradually shaped themselves into something resembling an agreement about what came next. I want to work, I said on the first day. We were in his office. Late afternoon. The Boston skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Doing what? He asked. Architecture. What I was trained for. What I was doing before the container. I paused. What I would be doing if my life hadn't been interrupted. He nodded slowly. That can be arranged. I have contacts. Legitimate firms. Projects that need architectural consultation. You'd work independently but under protection. What does that mean? It means you have employment. You have income. You have professional identity. But you're never alone. Someone is always aware of your location. Someone is always positioned to extract you if necessary. I'm not a valuable asset to extract, I said. You're more valuable than you understand. Alessandro replied. You're a witness. You're someone who can testify. You're also someone who's chosen to remain with me despite having federal alternatives. That choice has meaning. That choice requires protection. The second day brought practical considerations. Where would I work? Which firms? Which projects? We settled on a small architectural practice in Cambridge that specialized in sustainable urban development. The owner was someone Alessandro had connections with, someone who understood the arrangement, someone who could provide legitimate employment while ensuring my safety remained paramount. "How long do I work there?" I asked. "As long as you want to," Alessandro said. "Until you decide you need something different. Until circumstances change. Until you decide to leave." "Can I leave?" "Yes," he said simply. "You can always leave. But I would ask that you understand the consequences of leaving. That you understand what leaving means in terms of your own safety. That you leave with full knowledge of what you'd be stepping back into." The third day was about logistics, hours, compensation, transportation, the mundane architecture of existence. I would work 3 days a week. The salary was generous, more than I'd made before the container, more than was strictly necessary for survival. The additional money represented something Alessandro didn't say explicitly, but communicated through the amount itself. Investment. Commitment. Understanding that I was building something beyond mere survival. Sophia visited on the evening of the third day. She brought wine. 2 glasses. We sat in the living room watching Boston's evening transition into night. "He cares about you," she said without preamble. "I don't know if that's accurate," I replied. "It doesn't matter whether it's accurate," Sophia said. "What matters is that he's demonstrated commitment. He's integrated you into his infrastructure. He's arranged legitimate employment. He's given you agency within constraints. That's about as close to caring as someone in his position can get." "What if I want more?" I asked. "What if this isn't enough?" "Then you'll want something he can't give," Sophia said. "Because his world doesn't have room for romantic fantasy. It has room for strategic partnership, for mutual benefit, for understanding that both people in the arrangement are getting something they need from it." "What am I getting?" I asked. "Safety," Sophia said immediately. "Security. Protection from people who would harm you. Employment. Identity. Purpose. All of it comes with obligations. All of it comes with visibility. All of it comes with being part of something larger than yourself. But you're getting those things, and you wouldn't have them if you'd chosen federal protection." I started work at the Cambridge firm on Monday. The name was Harrison & Associates. On my first morning at Harrison & Associates, I didn't ask for a tour. I asked for a floor plan. The receptionist, the kind of unflappable that people mistake for shy, handed me a laminated map and a badge. The building was a problem set. 2 stairwells, 1 freight elevator, a lobby that pooled strangers in a single glass bowl. Alessandro's people wanted to post up outside. I said we were not turning a civil office into a stage. We compromised. Staggered arrivals, a panic phrase I could say in a sentence without breaking it, and a rule I wrote on a sticky note and pressed into my own palm. No one draws a gun around me unless the world is already on fire. We ran a drill without calling it one. The panic phrase slipped into a conversation about coffee, and 3 people did exactly what we'd rehearsed. Log off, stand, walk. No sprinting, no heroics, no speeches. The building emptied in under 4 minutes. Someone complained about losing a paragraph to the autosave. I said a paragraph is cheaper than a life. No one argued. I was not hired to save anyone. I was hired to make a museum that taught a city to read itself. The archive looked like a shipyard for paper. Gray metal stacks, boxes with codes that meant something to the person who'd written them, and almost no one else. 2 days later, we pushed the tables together and called it a charrette because names make people braver. A teacher from Dorchester wanted her students to see the city like a palimpsest. A bus driver from East Boston wanted a wall of roots that showed where the city pinched people without asking. An elderly couple brought a folder of permits from a bakery that had moved 3 times and survived each one. We taped everything to the wall until the room looked like the inside of a complicated head. It didn't make the city simpler. It made it legible. I started with labels, then with routes. If you want a public to move, you give it a spine. If you want a team to move, you give it an exit. By lunch, we had both. I opened my mouth to scream, and something came down hard across my jaw. Not a fist. Something textured. A cloth soaked in chemicals that burned my throat and made my vision tunnel inward toward a shrinking point of light. The gray dress I'd worn to 3 interviews that day became irrelevant. My hair, which I'd spent 40 minutes styling that morning, became just something to grab. On the way back from the museum, we ran a decoy route that Alessandro's driver called boring. Boring is a choice, I told him. We changed lanes when no one would and didn't when everyone did. A sedan that had looked like a coincidence turned into a trend and then into a mistake. At the bridge, we let it pass. At the next light, it didn't signal. The next day, we took the bus because patterns metabolize around cars. It was the sort of route where strangers become a temporary choir. The same stops, the same sighs, the same choreography of hands for the chord. No one followed. Boredom is an accomplishment you have to earn. People show you who they are when the pattern asks them to be patient. My apartment, the one I'd fought so hard to afford even during unemployment, the one that was supposed to be my sanctuary while the rest of my life reorganized itself, became a place where I ceased to be Olivia Grant, 26-year-old architect, and became something else entirely. By the afternoon, we had a stand-up that didn't pretend to be agile but was honest about blockers, a vendor who kept missing deliveries, a grant report that wanted numbers we didn't collect, a door that insisted on squealing at the worst possible moment. I drew a line on the whiteboard and asked everyone to put their problem on one side and the smallest next action on the other. We didn't solve anything dramatic. We made a list that fit on a single page. The next hit never made a noise. It arrived as a spreadsheet that didn't balance and a purchase order that aged backwards. A supplier froze our account because a fax said so. The fax number belonged to a company that dissolved last winter. We didn't call the police. We called the bank, the bank's lawyer, and the lawyer's calendar. By midnight, the freeze was a note. By morning, the note was an apology. And by lunch, the apology was a clause in a new contract. Less cinematic, more permanent. Small practice. 5 architects. Work focused on sustainable development. Mixed-use properties. Urban revitalization. Important work. Work that felt like it mattered. My office was small but well-designed. Morning light through eastern windows. Quiet enough to concentrate. Visible enough that people knew I was there. On my first day, I understood immediately that everyone working there knew exactly what I was. Not explicitly, but through the careful way they treated me. The gentle professionalism. The understanding that my presence in their firm represented something beyond normal employment. At lunch, the principal architect, a woman named Helena in her 50s, sat across from me in the break room. "Alessandro explained your situation," she said without preamble. "I want to be clear about something. You're safe here. Your work is legitimate. Your role is genuine. But you're also being protected. My responsibility is to ensure that protection doesn't interfere with the work you're doing." "What happens if it does?" I asked. "Then we adjust," Helena said simply. "We move your schedule. We adjust project assignments. We do whatever is necessary to maintain both the legitimacy of your employment and your safety." Over the following weeks, I began to understand how Alessandro's world actually functioned, how legitimate and illegitimate operations could exist in parallel, how someone could be genuinely interested in sustainable urban development while simultaneously running operations that operated outside legal constraints, how protection could coexist with purpose. I was working on a project involving a mixed-use development in Jamaica Plain when federal investigators returned to ask about my trial testimony timeline. Victor was considering a plea deal. Within days, the rumor hardened and then fractured. Offers on the table, counter offers in the air, nothing signed. By the time the motions calendar settled, the deal was smoke, and the path pointed back to trial. The motions calendar became a weather report. Routine, occasionally violent, always slightly wrong. Subpoenas arrived with the thud of thin bricks. Discovery felt like moving an attic with your hands, box by box, label by label, the shape of the whole only visible when you sat on the floor at the end and counted what was missing. Multiple counts, mandatory minimum sentencing. My testimony was no longer strictly necessary, but I could still provide it if I chose. "I'll testify," I told Morrison when she called. "You understand the defense will argue bias?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "You understand they'll suggest you've been influenced by your proximity to Ricci?" "Yes," I said again. "But I'm testifying about what happened to me. That's not influenced. That's just truth. After disconnecting, I understood what I'd actually chosen. Not Alessandro. Not protection, but integration into something larger. Something that included legitimate work. Something that included agency within constraints. Something that included being part of an infrastructure that served purposes beyond my individual survival. Alessandro was waiting when I returned to the penthouse that evening. He had documents spread across the dining table. Architectural drawings, property acquisitions, business expansion. His world. Your trial testimony is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, he said. I know, I replied. You understand what that means? Yes, I said. It means I testify about what happened. It means I'm visible. It means people know I'm connected to you. It means everything becomes more complicated. Yes, he agreed. All of that, and you're still choosing to remain? I looked at him across the table, at the carefully controlled expression, at the intelligence in his eyes, at the understanding that we were two people who'd found each other through trauma and constructed something that resembled partnership. Yes, I said. I'm choosing to remain. 7 months slid by in increments that didn't feel like time. Status conferences, discovery skirmishes, a calendar that kept ratcheting toward a fixed point. When the date finally landed and held, before the courthouse, there were rooms that didn't echo. The prosecutor, careful, dry, allergic to adjectives, walked me through questions that would land, and questions that were just invitations to bleed. Morrison sat in the corner, hands folded, asking nothing until it mattered. If you don't remember, you say you don't remember, the prosecutor said. If a detail is a smell or a color and not a date, you say that. Jurors live in houses. Give them rooms to stand in. We practiced the part where I would need to say his name and the part where I didn't. We practiced what silence would feel like if the air went thin. They didn't promise safety. They promised process. It was oddly kinder. The mock cross felt like being asked to fold a map while running. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. So you're saying you remember the smell of bleach, but not the date, he said, not as a question. I remember the smell, I said. I wrote the date down after. And you didn't go to the police the same night. I went to the morning I could stand in a room without counting exits. He nodded like a metronome. Rhythm is a way to make people confess to tempo. We kept going until the answers stopped trying to be perfect and started being true. Morrison didn't correct. She added nouns, chain of custody, corroboration, scope. Words you can hang a memory on without making it carry more than it should. The courthouse was a different kind of cage. Glass and marble, and the formal architecture of justice. I sat in a witness room waiting to be called, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the past 6 weeks working at Harrison & Associates on a sustainable development project in Jamaica Plain. 6 weeks of legitimate employment. 6 weeks of learning to exist in professional spaces. 6 weeks of building something that resembled a future. And now, I was back in the space where the past would be formally documented and set into the legal record. Morrison had prepared me. Prepared me again, technically, since I'd already testified before the grand jury. But grand jury testimony was different from trial testimony. This was public. This was Victor in the courtroom. This was defense counsel asking questions designed to undermine my credibility. This was the full machinery of legal process grinding forward toward whatever resolution it would reach. The defense lawyer was a woman in her 60s. Sharp, professional. She asked me to recount the container, to describe the conditions, to explain how I knew what was happening. And then the questions shifted toward Alessandro. You say you were taken from your apartment by men you didn't know, she said. Yes, I confirmed. And the next person you remember clearly is a man named Alessandro Ricci, who was at the dock when your container was opened. Yes. And you've been living in his home for the past 6 weeks? Yes. Would you characterize your relationship with Mr. Ricci as romantic? The question was designed to make me defensive. Instead, I answered with precision. I would characterize it as complicated, I said. He saved me from immediate danger. He's provided protection that I felt I needed. Our relationship exists in spaces that don't fit neatly into existing categories. The defense counsel didn't like that answer. She tried again with different phrasing, different angles, but my testimony remained consistent. I'd been trafficked. Victor's organization had orchestrated it. The Russian cartel had operated through specific channels. I'd seen specific evidence. By the time my testimony concluded, I understood that the defense wasn't actually trying to prove Victor innocent. There was no deal left to take. Whatever had been floated had collapsed under its own math. The defense was trying to establish that the prosecution's case relied on witnesses with questionable credibility, that my proximity to Alessandro created bias, that my testimony should be weighed with skepticism. It worked to some degree. The jury heard the questions. But the evidence was overwhelming. Victor's organization had operated the trafficking network. Documentation existed. Financial records existed. Communication logs existed. My testimony provided the human element, the story of what trafficking actually meant. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on 7 counts. Mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines meant Victor would spend at least 40 years in federal prison. He would likely die in federal custody. The trafficking network he'd orchestrated was officially dismantled. Morrison called me to say the investigation was closed. The federal case was resolved. I was no longer officially a protected witness. I could do what I wanted with my life. "What do you want to do?" Alessandro asked that evening. We were in his office. He was reviewing documents. I was standing at the window watching Boston's lights multiply across the darkness. "I want to keep working," I said. "At Harrison & Associates. I want to keep living here. I want to understand what this becomes if we stop measuring it against what should be happening and just observe what is actually happening." He set down his pen. "You're saying you want to remain. I'm saying I want to build something," I clarified. "Something that extends beyond survival. Something that includes work. Something that includes partnership. Something that exists in the space between what the federal system offered and what I could have rebuilt on my own." Sophia visited 2 days after the verdict. She brought wine again. We stood on the penthouse balcony watching the city below. "He's invested in you," she said. "Not just financially, strategically. He's positioned you in a way that protects his interests while also protecting yours. That's significant. What if it doesn't work?" I asked. "What if this arrangement becomes untenable? Then you leave," Sophia said simply. "But you leave with resources. You leave with legitimacy. You leave with a professional history that's clean. You leave with options that you wouldn't have if you'd made different choices." Over the following months, my life developed shape and structure. 3 days a week at Harrison & Associates working on projects that mattered. 3 evenings a week in Alessandro's penthouse. Weekends that belonged to both of us, and to neither of us simultaneously. Sophia became something like a friend. She understood the architecture of what I'd chosen, the compromises it required, the benefits it provided. Federal investigators came one final time. They wanted to close their investigation files. They asked if I'd experienced any pressure to alter my testimony, if I'd received compensation beyond the housing and employment Alessandro had provided, if I felt I'd been coerced in any way. No, I answered to all of it. I testified truthfully about my experience. I remained in Mr. Ricci's home because I felt it was safer than the alternatives available to me. I accepted employment because I wanted to work. None of this represents coercion. They recorded the statement. They closed the file. My status as a trafficking victim officially transitioned to my status as a professional who'd survived trafficking and rebuilt a functional life. The mixed-use development project in Jamaica Plain moved forward. My architectural work was solid, legitimate, visible in professional portfolios and publications. I began receiving other project inquiries from firms that understood the value of working with someone who'd been publicly associated with surviving trafficking. My professional credibility increased. By month 9, Alessandro introduced me to a commercial property opportunity, a warehouse renovation project in Seaport. Legal project. Clean documentation. But positioned in a location that happened to be strategically important to his operations. He was offering me the opportunity to develop legitimate expertise in an area that served both my professional growth and his organizational interests. "This is the beginning of actual partnership," he said when he presented the opportunity. "Not protection, not arrangement. Partnership." I understood what he was offering. Not love in the romantic sense, but integration. Genuine partnership where both people's interests aligned. Where my professional growth served his strategic goals and his protection enabled my professional growth. I accepted the project. 13 months after being pulled from the container, I existed in a space I couldn't have imagined. I was employed legitimately and effectively. I was developing professional reputation in sustainable urban development. I was integrated into Alessandro's infrastructure in ways that served both of us. I was protected by visibility rather than invisibility. I was building something that extended beyond mere survival. Was it perfect? No. Did it contain moral complications? Absolutely. Did it exist in legal gray areas? Frequently. But it was mine. It was a life I was actively building rather than a life that had been imposed upon me. And that distinction, I was learning, mattered more than any romantic fantasy about rescue or redemption could ever matter. The penthouse remained my residence. The work remained my purpose. Alessandro remained a presence that was becoming less about protection and more about partnership. Sophia remained the person who understood the architecture of what I'd chosen. And somewhere beneath the city streets, the world continued moving through moral complexities and strategic partnerships, and the messy reality of people making choices that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. I was surviving. I was thriving. I was building. And that would have to be transformation.